Chetan, how are we doing, sir?
I'm good. I'm good.
Oh, oh, good.
Boom.
Jacob, how are you today, sir?
Hi guys.
What's going on, Jacob? You doing all right?
I'm doing all right. It's good to be here with you. I'm ready to get netted.
Netted. That's the
I've
phrase.
been wanting to say that for a few nets
Get
now.
netted.
So.
Get netted. Oh, wow. That is a fantastic phrase. Hey, Jake, everyone needs to listen to Jacob's like audio recording. He had a music recording that he did on, that was so beautiful. His vocals were so good as well. I didn't know you did guitar, Jacob. That was hot. Sam.
It's just getting started. Thank you so much.
Oh, I look forward to it. That audio clip that you did, like literally I had it on loop and I looked, it was like, oh, it's like 3 hours. So it really got me in kind of the zone. I'm addicted to doing work, either like lo-fi, Max Richter, or Super Nintendo RPG video game music like Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger. Those are the best for like getting in the loop. So any music like that really does it for me, Jacob. So I appreciate it.
All right. I hope I can provide some more at some point.
Excellent, excellent. And Sam, how are you doing, Sam? You doing all right?
Hey, yeah, I'm good. I'm just in my hometown at a cafe.
Oh, that's wonderful. Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
Awesome. Your Substack piece was outstanding on gentrification. I really enjoyed that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think I'm going to expand on it a little bit. Yesterday, I did the Simone Weil seminar with Justin.
Nice.
It was really good and like gave me lots to think about.
Mm. That's awesome. What like do you want to kind of tie into it? Because I thought it was a really beautiful piece. So yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
I think like I'd like to think through the solutions a little more, like how do we get out of that loop? And I think like tying it to Simone Weil's idea of affliction is really sensible. And I feel like she also has a good sense of solutions, but maybe just like tying that more into architecture and development and community development, just to give my spin on it.
Yay, that's so exciting. Yeah, and I love the idea of like where neighbors are not neighbors anymore, like that concept that where there's kind of this disconnection, and it makes me think a lot about how so much is outsourced today. Like even our foods come from very far away, and it means that we've kind of like quite literally lost touch with what we consume and we do. Like a big part of being neighborly is to, in a sense, kind of consume each other's time. And so I think that was like really interesting and made me think a lot about. I loved your point on the, basically like the idea of a celebratory dinner being at home, how it changes if there's options to go out and eat and how people view that. And I was actually just thinking too, like very random, but I was thinking about when you get food from people you don't know, and how, in a sense, sometimes people like, they might like hate their job in the bad kitchen, like, you don't know, maybe they love it, maybe they hate it, you just don't know, right? But like one of the reasons why like I love my mom's cooking so much is because I know it's made with love, and it's just like, it's also the whole communal experience of like chopping onions together and all of that. And that's lost a lot from some of our conveniences. And sometimes I think that it's funny because the word convenience has the word convene in it, and we've lost convening, and we have convenience sometimes, and I think that can be somewhat problematic. So anyways, just wanted to say I love your piece. I hope everyone goes and reads it. It's on Sam's Substack. So
thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I wanted to Simone. I mean, her book "Waiting for God," her work on the Iliad is tremendous as well. And I mean, when she talks about affliction, kind of as the notion that you're stuck in a self-relating logic, you can't even think anymore. Like she goes and works in the factories, right? And she's really believing in the possibility at that point of like a Marxist revolution, but then seeing how the working class very thinking is kind of trapped in a structure of understanding that doesn't even allow thinking, really. And how affliction, when you talk about, and I like that term, and it brings to mind kind of the total depravity of Calvin, but I kind of like it because it's kind of a social structure. It's more of like the A is A logic. We'll talk about, it's like a self-relation that cannot escape itself. And how she brings to that the kind of, to me, the opposite of affliction for her is her doctrine of attention, right? Like really having that attention, which I think when Javier shows up, we'll let him get his Martin Buber quota, because it's the I thou kind of notion as well. And where when you really like, in one of the books, he says something like basically attention like makes the object. like if you paying attention to it transforms what it is. So it makes me think of like when you have your mom making the food, there's a different kind of attention to the food, right? And likewise, when you have communities that aren't globalized out of existence or made to feel like kind of impoverished or stuck in a certain affliction, that affliction leads to a certain alienation, a certain disembodiment, where attention to the community can literally transform the community, as attention to food can literally transform what the food is. And it makes me think too, like if we tie it, it's kind of that movement that I always talk about, like from self-consciousness to reason, which is the becoming other that Hegel talks about, because I have my Hegel quote. And it's interesting to see how you have all of these thinkers on this idea that just the very just literally paying attention, like, and by that she doesn't mean just mere focus, but like really, really seeing has a transformative impact on people. And where if we don't do that with other people or the world around us, we get trapped in this affliction. We get trapped in this self-relating system that it cannot escape. And it makes me think, I always like C.S. Lewis describes hell as a place that's locked from the inside. It's locked from the inside, but you don't have the idea of leaving. Like you never get the idea to leave. Like if you just check the door, you could leave. And there's something about affliction that's so fascinating in her work, because it's something that's locked from the inside, and yet it's technically unlocked, but practically speaking, because of how it organized his thinking, you never try to leave. And how attention could be a doctrine to bring one out of that. So I think applying her work to the questions of, the decay of decadence and all these things is a fascinating move.
Yeah, that makes me think, like yesterday during the seminar, I felt like these ideas were really connected to the despair as described by Kierkegaard. And he describes it, like there's two fundamental despairs: wanting and despair to be one's own self, and wanting and despair not to be oneself. And like, I think that really it kind of identifies the root, which is which is an attention to self, to what yourself is.
Just really quick, I want to say that like I really am interested in the word attention and how it has, like, if you think about it, attending, and how it's about like tending, like you like tending to a garden, right? So there's a lot of kind of this ability to sort of like manage and attend and be present for this ability to attend to yourself, right? And when you're attended to yourself, you're attuned to yourself, right? You can kind of hear like that inner voice, if you want to call it that. But that's also what allows us to, I think, have the best ability to attend to others as well. So there's sort of this dialectical process of attention to yourself that then allows you to give your real attention to the other as well. So yeah, I've always been interested in that word. And really quick though, as a counter to attention, Adam Phillips likes to talk about inattention. And he has a book on about attention, and how actually, like a lot of times, some of the problems with maybe taking a more, let's say, like not really holistic approach to solving people's symptoms is when we actually pay too much attention to the symptom. And he's saying, like, let's actually get inattentive to that and more attentive to the attending to self, the actual attention to the context and the garden that is you. So anyways, I just wanted to bring that up too.
No, that's wonderful. And Dimitri, I haven't said hello to you. Good to see you, sir. And as usual, anyone wants to speak, raise hand, throw clay at the screen, anything like that. It makes me think how if attention, like in Vey, has this ability to kind of multiply or grow something, then attention, like focusing on the wrong thing, could be really bad, right? And you're always already in the game of giving attention to something. And so like when you focus on something, that can kind of grow it. And if you focus on something bad, or like, oh, that person is always mean, or that person never puts down the toilet seat or whatever, then it grows into a crisis, right? Or something like that. And then it makes me think how maybe a way of course, one of the reasons we don't pay attention to others is because that risks encountering, all the problems of Lacan and psychoanalysis in the real, right? Because other people can be difficult. So we're like, well, we're not going to do that because that's really hard. But then if you don't do that, you can end up in affliction. Or you can say, well, we'll deal with it by always being distracted with screens. So then if our focus is always kind of everywhere, we don't have to worry about growing anything with it. But then, of course, we're alienated. Then, of course, we're never embodied, and we don't have, she has that book, I think it's called The Need for Roots, whereas he talks about a lot how you need roots today. And if you don't have roots, that leads to an alienation. And she refers to human beings that don't have a home or a community or a tradition, like a flower that's kind of been pulled out and it can't grow anywhere. But then, of course, one of the reasons we don't have roots is because we don't want to be rooted and we don't want to be stuck. We want to go explore. We want to go see the world, right? But then how that also leads to a kind of diffusing of attention to where we're never really focusing on anything. And that means nothing ever grows. But then if nothing ever grows, we can feel, you can enter the meaning crisis, right? The Vervaeke stuff, the kind of alienation. So it's very interesting how you have all of these, this doubleness that one has to kind of work through and figure out. And where basically the brain hates doubleness. The brain just wants a single solution. So we either say it's one or the other, and then we kind of fall off in a ditch on either side of it.
Appreciating all of the philosophical vibrations that are coming my way. It's been very enlivening, and I don't have any particular contribution to make at this point, but I can feel it deeply, deeply resonating with the sort of core disposition I'm taking to my own life, and how I'm attending to my own time, and that issue of like having like, oh, like I'm struggling, and then I free myself from that, and then it's like possibility opens up, and then suddenly loads of possibilities and loads of things that I could work on, and then it gets to be a little too much for capacity or too many places that I could go, and then I'm like reining it back in. And so I'm sort of in that right now. And yeah, before continuing, I just wanted to say hi, Sam. I haven't met you before, so it's nice to meet you. You just moved on my screen. And hello to Chetan. I hope that's right. I think I've met you before, and Dimitri, of course, and Alexander just joined. I haven't met you before, but nice to meet you, sir, as well.
Thank you, Jacob, and I appreciate that. And Mr. Ebert, good to see you. No, it's really interesting because like when Simone Weil is talking about attention, it really is the sense that attention is how you escape the quote unquote self-relating of affliction. And yet there's something about human beings like where it's funny how we want to pay attention to bad things, right? And usually bad things in other people, how they always like slurp their spoon when they drink their soup, right? Like we're really focused on how they talk when they're chewing and how rude that is. And we like make that super big and super alive, which the fact that we can do that shows the power of attention, that we can make the fact that they like slurp their soup when they eat it the biggest thing in the world. And yet we always want to direct our attention towards stuff like that, as opposed to the other in the way that Simone is saying that could help us escape the affliction that happens at the working place where your mind turns off because you're just trying to get through the day, or Hannah Arden's banality of evil. And it's so interesting how you it's so important to me with Vey, like you're always already giving attention to something, or you've so distracted your focus to the point where you don't have attention. And that seems to be a kind of problem. So how can one get in the habit to make sure that what they focus on is say, I want to say the good, but then you would have to go through what that means, or to focus on something that would put a demand back on you to be more open to the other, to get out of your comfort zone, to not focus on things that's self-confirming. Because the other thing we seem to like to give attention to is things that confirmation bias, things that confirm ourselves, things that make us comfortable. And really when I read Vey, and I think like with Simone too, when we read her work on the Iliad, how like she says the Iliad is the poem of force, right? I think is the opening line. It's kind of the idea that we're just kind of pushed by different forces. And the world is made by forces, whether it be forces of work, bosses, oppression, violence, and she goes through the whole Iliad. I think that's the only piece she may have published in her life, actually. And the rest is a lot of notebooks. I'm not sure about that. Don't quote me on that. But it's like attention is the only way to kind of escape those systems of force. But of course, the nature of force is to draw attention to itself and to multiply it and to kind of control the framework of the discussion and the conversation. So it's interesting to kind of look, and I kind of feel like it would be interesting, and then I'll pass it to whoever wants to speak. It would be interesting almost to make a distinction between like focus and attention. I wonder if there's this distinction there, because a lot of people talk about the need to regain focus and the ability to focus, but often that kind of feels like just like focusing on your project, your capitalist job, or to be productive. And it's kind of interesting how you have all of these, like there's truth to it, like there's a need to regain focus, but sometimes it can have almost a Deleuzian capture for the system. I'm not sure, I'm thinking about it like the difference between this focus people talk about today and what she means by attention. But let me give it to Dimitri. Dimitri, good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, good to see you guys too. I think this is a very interesting topic, and I mainly have some questions here for all of you. These days in spiritual circles, people like to say it's about living in the moment, and not like going off into the abstractions of your mind. There's some kind of, there's some religious ontologies that are all about rejecting language because they're all abstract concepts anyhow. This is of course like this is old stuff, but I wonder like, okay, yeah, so we have the words attention, then there's focus, then there's also awareness, and what Osho says on meditation to me is very interesting. He says meditation has no technique. Meditation is not about focusing in, like it's not about like having this tunnel vision on like one point or something. It's about an expansive awareness that that you are receptive about everything that happens, and you are like at the point of an observer, right? My question is like, what do you guys think about this idea of living in the moment? Like, what does that mean to attention? Is it like I don't even know how to frame my question because I'm so much at a loss like how to think about it. But I think, well, maybe I can put it like this: like there's strategic thinking, where you really have to think deeply about things, or when you're planning, you're kind of like, to go from your work, Daniel Garn, you talked about the difference between planning and vision, right? And like you can start planning when you have some kind of vision, but usually those plans are disturbed by life itself all the time. But when you do planning as an activity, you're not living in the moment. I think this is, this is something we can say. So, what is it about this whole living in the moment kind of thing? What does it even mean to live in the moment? That's my question.
Just really quick, I think that's a great question, Dimitri, and I'll say really quickly, just to go back to the word attention. I think something that's helpful for me is thinking about how the word attention, I broke it down to like tending to the garden, and it also makes me think of a tent, literally, like what is your habitat, what's like home or place are you in, and are you offering to those around you? So I mean, I think perhaps, it's almost like, yeah, when we get a lot of the push on live in the moment, live in the moment, live in the moment, now we're paranoid that we're not living in the moment, so we're definitely not living in the moment. It's great. So I think that I wonder if we could get just more, I mean, this also can be pushed, so it's hard. Like you're saying, language sort of fails, but what home are we in, and like what home are we extending? I wonder if that could kind of allow us to sort of resituate what attention could be and how that might relate to the present moment.
Yeah, that's a fact. Let me give it to Chitan, Mr. Ebert. And it makes me think, like, there seems to be a difference between living in the moment at the expense of others, and that's like egocentric. And then there's a living in the moment that helps you not get lost in your head. Mm-hmm. And what this really brings to my attention as well, just quickly, is like how basically all these things have like some degree of truth to them. And yet you have to think about how it's not exactly the same. And this really speaks to like I want to say the necessity of philosophy, or at least critical thinking, because there's like a truth to living in the moment, but then it depends. Like it depends. Maybe it's contingent. What do you mean by that? There could be living in a moment that is, Mr. Ebert's work on cancer could be the moment never dies. So then you avoid death and you become cancerous, right? Because you're always living in the moment. But then there's a living in the moment that's transience. And transience itself is where you accept transience. And there's a beauty in that. So what do you mean by living in the moment? It's very interesting how all of these things have a doubleness to them. But let me give it to Chitan and then Mr. Ebert.
Hi, everyone. Discussion actually is, will take us all kind of places. No, I remember hearing a story a long time back, and I want to share the story with you. It'll start off in that sense. I remember, a person telling me that, the spiritual guru kind of person, he was writing in that sense that when somebody comes to their house to sort of, ask for spiritual guidance and so on and so forth, and the person can't give you any guidance, what they would normally do is they would steal something from the house and go. So they came to take something. So whatever they can get their hands upon, they'll take it. So there is that kind of quality with attention in that sense. Attention at one level, actually, we all need it. It's something like food, which we don't realize. You can and it can come in all kinds of forms. It can come in the form of junk food. It can come in forms of healthy food in that sense, and it comes in all kinds of varieties of but it's interesting that attention is that minimal level of our own psychic break, which allows us to actually sort of find an outside in that sense within our psychic apparatus. If we have to encounter the outside in some way, I think attention is that point where when that's why you said A is a logic. That logic gets broken because of that there is that degree of the outside that becomes accessible through attention. And how do you think through that problem vis-a-vis not simply thinking through in the sense that attention itself is great and hunky-dory, that attention comes in all forms of there can be very bad forms of attention, very toxic forms of attention that you can get, that you can be getting in that sense. But the question is that what is it about attention that eventually you have to find a way forward from that tunnel in that sense? And I think Dimitri's question is important to think through that.
Excellent. I'll pass to Mr. Ebert. Mr. Ebert, you're making me hungry. I have to say, like, I'm hungry.
You
now.
see what I'm doing?
It looks like you're cooking, Mr. Ebert.
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
So anyway, I have a lot of thoughts on this. Yeah, everything everyone said, I think, points in the right direction. So I'll just sort of rattle off a couple of important pieces to me. First of all, the moment implies timelessness. So there's a certain collapse of time. So that's really important to remember. So being in the moment has something to do with a sense of timelessness, the parietal lobe, which is operating our sense of time and space. And so being in the moment, there's some sort of sense of timelessness. Now, with regard to the observer, what Dimitri brought up, I think that's a very important point. And I've actually been writing a lot about that. So you have observation itself, which, according to quantum mechanical math, observation is the thing responsible for actually collapsing the waveform state of particles and sort of, their ability to occupy multiple states at once, the multifarious, multiplicitous, indeterminate essence of a given particle is only collapsed into a proton or a neutron or an electron upon observation, right? So in theory, the entire thing that we take to be reality, like, determinate reality, is all one big misrepresentation of a more fundamental indeterminacy. So that's observation. So observation collapses form, right? So that doesn't sound like it's very in the moment observation. However, there's the state which I'm calling like the last gaze, like the witness state, drishti yoga, or the arriving at the Atman or the state of Brahman, where the determinacy dissolves into indeterminacy. So what kind of observation is that? I'm still observing things, and things are still in form. So I'm still collapsing things vis-a-vis observation, but I am now observation itself. So what's the difference between the normal sort of like attentionalist paradigm where I'm observing myself, but I'm also feeling collapsed by myself, and then the state of the witness, which is observation itself? And I think the big difference is that the state of observation itself has no one else left to observe the observer. You're in the position of the final gaze. So you cannot be collapsed. You are that which collapses but cannot be collapsed. You are not a determinate identity, but you can witness the determinate identities by collapses that transcends identity. And so that to me is the sort of being in the moment, where you are the final observer. You are occupying the position of the last gaze. You are neither sort of here nor there yourself. You don't have any determinate identity yourself. You can witness yourself as yourself, like, oh, look at Alex Ebert, but you're not Alex Ebert, and that's the place of being in the moment to me, because that's also, of course, timeless. And the reason, by the way, why it's timeless in my view is because time requires relation. And if you are occupying the state that is the observer that cannot be collapsed, then as an uncollapsed form, you are the totality of form. So you are that indeterminate aspect, which within itself has no relationality within itself to itself. And because there's no relation, because of an excess of relation, you have no time. You are the moment. You are kairotic as opposed to chronic.
Excellent, Mr. Ebert. I'll give it to Dimitri there. And I really like this idea of how we always talk about indeterminacy to determinate with observation, but what about the flip? Like when you start to see the determinant in indeterminacy, but you are actually the kind of timeless consistency of that. And that's a wonderful kind of flip there to think through. I really like that. And it actually, everything you're saying too, like how precisely at the moment there's timelessness, and yet the word moment applies the most radical level of transience, and how things come together in that way, which brings to mind your work. That right there kind of, to me, suggests why there always seems to be this kind of doubleness that's going on in things. It's like as you approach a point, that actually starts to bring out the other thing that should be brought into consideration. It depends on how you think about it and that you approach it. And it also then makes me think that we were talking about, because we were talking about Simone Weil and how she has this doctrine of attention versus affliction. Sort of affliction is where kind of you're put in a state where you don't even think about your condition in the working class. You have a level of oppression where you can't even think how to leave, whereas attention could be a doctrine to bring you out of that. And it's interesting to think that if you don't consider attention, it's almost like you don't take ownership of your ability to control how things collapse. Don't take control of how the world presents itself, and you've outsourced it to the system. And so you've removed that great ability that you have, and you can't even enter into the sphere of the things that you are considering. So I find that fascinating, and I'm going to pass it here to Dimitri. And maybe as a note, maybe like a lot of this talk about regaining focus so you can do your project or escaping ADD, the problem with it is they're talking about focus as merely like paying attention to a thing in the world or project, and not this entire sphere of ability that you're bringing out, Mr. Ebert, that would be more akin to what attention could possibly mean. So it's like, it's close to, it's better, but it's not the whole. And maybe in that way it's worse because you think you're getting attention when you're only getting focus, and you're missing out on the entire other part of the story that needs to be taken into consideration. It would be interesting if Simone was alive today, if she would have things to say about maybe the difference between focus and attention as she's putting forth.
Yeah, Ebert, those are all very interesting ideas. Something that it reminded me of was Aristotle's prime mover. Since the prime mover in Aristotle isn't caused by anything, it observes anything that's being caused, and it's the cause of all these things. It's like the capital C cause. That's the cause of all the causes. But in itself, it's not caused. That's what Aristotle argues, and that's why, Islam, they will reference this theory by Aristotle to prove Allah's existence. Now, my question to you would be, what is the relation? You said relationship collapses, and I really like your language of, being in the moment, or like living in the moment. There implies a timelessness. I really think that's really fantastic. Now, what you said, relation itself collapses. So, is there even a distinction between the observer and the moment then? And if there is no distinction, if the observer and the moment are one of the same, does that really hold up? How does this work?
If I could respond, so observation collapses itself, and collapses, and relation is a result of those collapses. Also, and the, I think what's interesting, in terms of like, is the observer the moment? So like, do we become time? Certainly my experience is that I am occupying the position of the moment, which itself, there's a very, time and space aren't as divided in my view as, say, Kant or something thought they were. Like, for instance, in my mind, if you were to hold the image of an apple in your mind, it's not only taking up time, which would have been Kant's view. To me, that's also taking up space. And time and space are interior and exterior qualities. So you know, from the position of the final view, or the last gaze, or the observation itself, you're occupying I suppose in a way there is a collapse of the subject into the object, or the subject into time and space. So in that sense, yeah, there is a collapse. It's essentially a sublation of sorts. One thing I wanted to just mention, like, you know, that Daniel was bringing up is, like, you know, the difference between this sort of repose, this observation itself, and then the idea of really focusing on, you know, a baseball. And they're actually not so different, and they lead to a very similar state in my view. And the reason is that if you create the limitation of, like, the mental limitation of baseball, this is what I'm thinking of, and you have those boundaries, and then you fill that boundary with baseball, and that's all you're thinking, and you're thinking, you're thinking, and you're focused, you will experience a very similar, essentially the process of sublation, but a very similar saturation within that very same limitation. And that saturation itself will fill up space and time with relationality. So baseball, 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 blah, 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 there, to the point where it's so congested and so replete with baseball that you enter again a timelessness, because relation has collapsed. But you've collapsed relation by circumscribing a very particular area of focus and filling that area with that particular object to the point of total saturation, at which point time collapses into the moment. And I think that's why when we do focus on a very specific task, we will lose ourselves and forget to eat, because we will be in a moment of pure saturation wherein there is no more internal relation within us. And so time sort of collapses within us. And yeah, I'd say that well, it's an interesting way you put it. Like, are we time? Is there a collapse? Like, are you the moment? I'd have to think about that. But my first thing would be that the questions of identity, of like what you become, I think get fully suspended. I don't think that questions of identity, like, well, then what are you? I think the whole point possibly is that you are the nothingness of everything, and there's no way to really quantify yourself at that point, which is the beauty of the moment.
Yeah, so one more question I had in regards to this is, what does this collapsing of the observation, or like the time into the moment, what does that do to the question of agency? To me, what you're describing, like the nothingness of everything, I also like this language. I think it's very much, it seems very much like a thing like that Meister Eckhart would agree with. He says that the ground of us and the ground of God is the same, and that you can come to this one knowing, or this one love, where the ground of me and the ground of God collapse on into each other, and there is this nothingness of everything. So is this the moment of absolute knowing? Is this the enjoyment of the absolute idea? How do you think about things like that?
I mean, I think so, and just I don't want to hog the conversation, but that, you know, the nothingness of everything is Hegel's term in phenomenology, like, you know, 4/5 of the way through, and yeah, to me, that's what Hegel's describing in terms of absolute knowing. It's that state of holding all the contradictions while yourself being sublated, unitary, and, you know, I mean, to me, that's, you know, that's what that is. In terms of agency, I think that's a really good question, and I think you can bring back in Deleuzian questions about, like, rhizomatic, and I think actually there's a way to combine the sort of Deleuzian Hegelian bridge, to bridge that divide, by understanding that, like, the moment of reaching that total saturation doesn't deprive us of agency, and in fact, in Hegelian terms, it makes us more distinct. The more internal sublimation, in Hegelian terms, in other words, the more internal saturation, unification, oneness internally vis-a-vis the saturation that comes up against the subjective limits, the apprehension of God, the state of awe, the being in the zone, whatever the case is, the more firm the form of being. So the more firm the limit presents itself to the external world. You can almost think about the difference between a deflated balloon that's just sort of wafting in the air, cutting like sort of a indeterminate edge across the sky, and then a fully inflated balloon cutting a very clear edge, like circle across the sky. You're like, I see what that is. That is different than the sky. That is very like presenting itself as a uniform sort of whole, and creating therefore difference between itself and the rest of the world. And so in a lot of ways, like the times that I personally, for instance, feel like I'm really interacting in the world with the world from a place of differentiation is when I no longer have internal contradiction. When I'm sort of replete with my own unification, that's when I'm suddenly very different from everyone else. So it's almost like the moment those self-contradictions resolve themselves vis-a-vis excess, the real contradictions between you and the rest of the world begin. And so in a lot of ways, it takes away a certain internal agency to be within a certain kind of internal conflict. And so there's less of a dialectic happening here. You've sublated, and now the dialectic is occurring between you as a uniform whole and then the rest of the world. And you're moving through the rest of the world and creating a different dialectic between your unified place and otherness.
I would like to add one more thing to this, and that is since the question of agency has come up, that also the question of freedom has come up, and there's this very interesting thing happening with freedom, is that the moment you posit that you are unfree, this is a radical moment of freedom. Because when you're unfree and you don't even posit it as unfreedom, that means you're just completely unfree. But like when you already posit it as like, okay, I am unfree, that is really a consciousness of freedom. And there's this inner necessity coming out of unfreedom that kind of reveals your own freedom in a sense, like this kind of transcendent freedom, the very deriving of the notion of freedom.
Well, identifying yourself as unfree collapses it into like a uniform form, and then you allow the self-relating negativity to be like, you know what, I don't want to be fucking unfree. So I've identified it as such. It's dead now. It's no longer an internal contradiction. Am I free? Am I unfree? No, I'm unfree. I'm a full-blown slave. And now I can deal with, now I can actually apply some self-relating negativity. How do I feel about being a fucking slave? And do I want to change that? As opposed to being in this sort of wafting state of vacillating, judgment, which I occupy all the time. It's much better, and I have a lot more force when I'm just like, no, you know what, this is wrong, or this is right. And usually when it's right, I also have to change it, because then now I'm bored. Success is, prompts the most of my boredom, actually. Anyway, I'm going to shut up. I want other people.
No, that's an excellent call. I'll just say very quickly, and I'm going to give it to Sam and Chetan. A few things. One, I would say the philosophy, very much so, philosophy of right, in my opinion, is where Hegel is proposing that a role of the state is to make individuals identify with their determinations as necessary for their freedom, and thus an expression of their freedom. So they have to like the determinations they find themselves faced with. The state is in the business of helping you realize that no, those determinations of law, those determinations of community, that those are actually increasing your freedom, and you need to learn to identify with them. However, this becomes quite difficult because there are there are things in the world that are taking advantage of you and causing affliction. So this is very difficult. But the name of the game is a way to see that freedom is actually like we all start off with a feeling of abstract freedom, meaning we shouldn't be restricted by anything. But then we are thrown into the world where we find determinants and things outside of our control. And then we can either spend our entire life fighting those things or come to actually see some identification with them, right? But then how do you do that, and how do you trust that this thing you think you should deconstruct is something you should deconstruct, and this over here you should identify with, actually, and see it as an enabling freedom? And that's like a lot of the entire political project that Hegel's interested in, which then aligns it with his other work, like you're saying, right? In the phenomenon, there's a point where everything and nothing combine, right? There's a point in the political project where having determination and freedom combine, right? These things come together. And then the question that I would ask on the notion of agency, is there a difference between, and I'll use the term total saturation, because I think it's a good term, like the total saturation that you can achieve with a baseball, and the total saturation or possibility of it with another person, like a non-inanimate object. So is there something about you focus on a baseball, whereas you give attention to a person, to use Simone Weil's term? Do you need that distinction? Why do you need that distinction? Is there something different of the art or the practice of attention in that way versus the focus on a baseball? Because the goal for both seems to be, like you're saying, a kind of total saturation. But what is the difference in the art form of the way of going about those things? Is there a difference? What does that look like? And maybe we can see the phenomenology of spirit as you start with objects and then you move to people, and it gets harder as you go along. So it's a thought that comes to mind. Let me give it to Miss Willem, and then I'll give it to Chetan.
Hey, yeah, I really wanted to sort of like mix some things into the conversation in a similar vein, because I thought when Alexander, I thought you did a really good job of unpacking the kind of processes and phenomenology of attention and being in that state. I love the term final gaze. It's really great. And it made me think that she was very suspicious of like group mindset and being part of movements, and she thought that really corrupted attention, and like she thought of attention as like waiting, like her text, the title is Waiting for God, and I think like the idea of waiting is really interesting. You're kind of silent and sitting still in reception, and an open reception, and I love how this like ties into questions of epistemology, which I thought, just like to add to this whole like soup of subjects, I thought this related really well to OG Rose. You had a recent post that took me like 3 days to read through on Hegel and thinking without axioms and presuppositions, and your idea of intersuppositional thought. I felt like there's some way that this fits into what we're talking about today. Like, yeah, when you, I just afraid like, purity of heart is to will one thing, another Kierkegaardism, it came to mind, because it's like, yeah, is there a way in that you can be in a state of purity of heart, willing one thing, but that thing is not narrow, it's in the full breadth of all that constitutes that thing. There's an openness there that I think when you have this, you have the dichotomy of like giving your attention to a being, an I and thou relationship. And then we have the West's idea of attention, which is usually a relation between subject and object, which has a hierarchy of observation. Is there a way in which you can have an openness of attention where even an object, you know, like you think of it in its full happening and it takes on a life, and there's a way of seeing the world maybe in that final gaze state that, you know, whether you're like focusing or directing that attention towards a being or a tree or what, anything, like there's an openness to it that lets you kind of know it in a way that isn't just presuppositional. I don't know. These are all the things that were going through my head as all you were talking. Thank you.
That's outstanding. I know. And first, thank you for reading that piece. It's very kind of you. I appreciate it. I'll give it to Chetan and Emilio. Really good to see you, sir. I hope you've been doing well. It's very interesting because there seems to be this openness to the other, this I thou that's really important. But then, of course, the problem is others take advantage of you, right? And there's lots of books that describe how like Hitler used empathy to control people. And so is there a difference between this attention and empathy? Also, you have Heidegger talking all about clearing, right? The clearing of being to make being arise. It seems to be similar to attention. Well, we know that political project can get into trouble, right? Because you end up clearing out people that get in the way of being unveiling itself, and that just tends to be other people of different minorities. Now, I know that's a hot topic and things like that, but it's interesting how you have all these different thinkers who have this kind of emphasis on something that we're calling like intersuppositional, between, and your suppositions are emerging from out of that. That seems really important, but then simultaneously that too has a doubleness, because we've talked about it before. What if like Lovecraft emerges, right? Not the beatific vision. You know, what if the I thou relationship, the thou turns out to be the name that starts with C in Lovecraft? I can't think, that reduces everything to ass. So there's an interesting doubleness to these things, but it also seems like the intersuppositional is necessary for the beatific vision of Dante, right? So why does it become Lovecraft versus Dante? What is that something in our control? But if it's in our control, that would seem like it's not a clearing, because it's back to the subject, right? You've fallen back into that. So it's a fascinating question.
I've been trying to think that how to organize my thoughts around this, and Ebert's and the liberty discussion was wonderful in that sense to start off. I think one of the reasons attention is so difficult to talk about beyond a point is because it's that form of humanness which sort of at which I think contradictions start playing havoc in that sense, in that zone all the time. For instance, if you look at Freudian thinking, I think that Freud says that becoming conscious is linked to attention for whatever reasons. That's something which was already there in the Freudian setup, that attention always demands this sufficient moving away from your immediate unconscious in that sense, or moving higher than. And if you look at your ego always sort of tries to collapse back upon itself. It's always trying to curtail the attention such that it can sustain its own immediate world in that sense. And how do you think through that kind of a structuring? I think one of the problems that immediately comes up, and I think Bernard Stiegler, the philosopher who writes about it, that there is something called primary retention, there's something called secondary retention. So primary retention is the things that we get immediately from our environment. So if I see a pen, there's a primary retention of the shape, color, and so on and so forth. And secondary retention is the memory that gets formed of it. And attention always sort of comes through the struggle between the primary and secondary retention. And one more entity gets added to it. It is what you call expectation. So if you see a baseball coming towards you, you do not see it at that moment. You are already expecting it to be somewhere else the next moment. It is in that expectation, what you may call potentials, that attention gets its shape. And attention, if it was only sort of dependent upon a secondary retention, if we were only selecting something from what we had before, then attention itself would have no meaning, isn't it? If the selection was merely automatic, then attention has no value. Attention has value because there is some kind of a gap within that automatic selection. You're not selecting something automatically. If you're selecting something automatically, you're destroying attention, which is what we say social media destroying attention. This kind of language we use in today's time. What we mean is that we've made that selection automatic for us. It's no longer conscious. It's no longer, in some sense, agentive. And I think it is at that point, it is at that crux where consciousness in this sense meets attention, because there is something which breaks that automatic loop in that sense, that attention finds its ground. And I think that's a discussion which I think Ebert and Dimitri were sort of engaging in. At what point does that break or that gap sort of completely affirms itself? At what point you're selecting something from your environment, but you're not completely dependent upon what you know from the past to actually ascertain its. And when you meditate, you do this kind of practices, you're actually trying to play with that gap. Can you, and if you read Jiddu Krishnamurti and these kind of people, what you get is this kind of an idea that you can attend something without having any pre-biased notions, any biases or any background, what Ebert sort of called, what the final observer in that sense. But it is essentially a way of playing with that gap. It is essentially to find a certain kind of freedom through an engagement with that gap, that you're not completely dependent upon making, attending to something upon your past judgments about it and so on and so forth. And how do you think through that structure, I guess, Yeah.
It makes me think, in the Kyoto school, they talk about the pure experience before the mirror stage, right? And there's a question is there attention in the pure experience? Or can you only have attention after the mirror stage? Well, that's the subject-object divide, right? Well, there's a problem with that, because you can, like we've like all these thinkers are kind of saying there's trouble with the subject-object divide. So it's almost like you can't have attention unless you have the ability to say almost like yes to something. Like you have the ability to be like, yes, this I'm going to focus on. But of course, if you say yes, you're vulnerable to the thing. You can misunderstand the thing, and there's all these different troubles. So it's interesting to think that maybe attention is not possible in the pure experience. It's only possible because of the possibility of the mistake of the subject-object divide, of which then allows a kind of yes affirmation, if you choose it, that then opens up a meaningful distinction between attention and maybe just everyday looking around in different things.
I want to say really quick, Chitan, maybe you can like address this question that came up for me. You said something about like basically like when it's in the unconscious, or it's if it was just based off of what happened, then it doesn't really require attention. But I kind of want to challenge that, or maybe just present a question, because it's kind of like when we think about delusion and repetition, like if you say the word smart over and over and over and over again, it's suddenly going to sound very unfamiliar, strangely enough, right? Even though in your unconscious you just recognize it, it doesn't stand out to you. You understand it as a form of communication, but it's not like you're not really paying attention to that word. But now when you say it over and over and over again, it sounds foreign, and it does kind of catch your attention, like that's so strange, this word sounds unfamiliar now to me in its repetition. It makes me think of what Alexander's bringing up about saturation, where there's this like saturation of hearing the word smart, that then suddenly it's like this lack of relation to it or something, like you almost can't relate to what are those sounds. And so I guess what I mean to say is, what do you think about that, Chitan? Like in a sense, yeah, it's not something new, but you kind of made it new to yourself through repetition somehow. Is that kind of drawing attention with something that actually was already there? So anyways, just what do you think? What do you think, Chitan?
Quickly, I'll sort of point out that with repetition, you can also take something out of attention. Repetition actually works both ways. If you repeat something again and again, you can almost detach and stop paying attention to it because of the. So then the question becomes that what is the relationship between, say, repetition and it's something discussion we've had discussion about this, that repetition always brings something newness alongside with it. Repetition has that quality that if something repeats radically, it can find a radical break with its own self. Something which I think Ebert was referring to when he was saying that there's pure unification, because up to a point the gap exists inside, but when the repetition happens radically, the gap suddenly moves radically outside, and what happens is a radical break with your environment arises, and so on and so forth. So repetition always can give you that minimal amount of possibility of something new coming into the world. And that, of course, has strong links with attention, because attention essentially is about selecting something from the environment that cannot be completely predetermined. If it can be completely predetermined, you can completely predict it, then attention has very little role over there. Attention essentially arises from where that complete capacity for predetermining something breaks down. Essentially, human beings have to find some way of dealing with the unpredictability of the environment in that sense. So, of course, repetition is at the heart of that break happening. Without that repetition, that break is not possible. And at the same time, repetition itself can be a way of not allowing the environment to actually enter into, not allowing you to engage with the environment at all, not allowing you to engage with the outside at all. So I think it can go either ways.
Thank you, Chitan. That was helpful.
No, it's a good comment. I'm going to give it to Emilio, Dimitri, and Alexander. It makes me think too why maybe a reason why this kind of like attention deficit disorder is problematic is because you don't have a repetition of focus on a thing to unveil that break. So then there's the possibility of a meaningful yes, as we were saying before. And that also makes me think of the painter Cézanne, where we would like look at things until they're like radically alive and heaves them. I thought you want to say something.
Just really quick, because I was like really happy that we're talking about attention, because I was reading Gabor Mate on attention deficit disorder. Basically, I never thought about this. It was so like mind-boggling, because I'd never thought about the fact that the word attention is in attention deficit disorder, because a deficit is where you're demanding that the child give more attention than it's being given. And so there's kind of an overcompensation where that sometimes that behavior is considered like bad behavior, but a lot of times it's coming from actually a depletion of attention that they're given. And this relates to what Freud said, what you brought up, Chitan, where I think it's like consciousness forms through attention. Children require attention. We have an appetite for attention. And it's and so basically, I think there's something really important about this idea being given the attention so that you can give attention, like I brought up with Sam Willman in the beginning. So anyways, I just wanted to speak to that. I think it's super interesting.
Lovely. I'll give it to him. It's almost like the fate of attention is the fate of the subject. And if you have bad attention, you're subjugated or something. So anyway, I like to explain on where. Emilio, how have you been, my friend?
I've been well, I've been like on Thursday I've been like occupied at like the specific hour. It's been frustrating, but I'm here, so I'm really happy to be here, and the conversation is always lovely. Just as I heard the conversation, what came into my mind was like how, like, just as an interesting experiment, or like a different way or angle of seeing this like attention moment, like and stuff, is like, of course, in regards to time, but almost like looking backwards. Like, for example, we always, like, if you want to pay attention, it's almost like linear, right? You first want to pay attention to the thing, you pay attention, and then like that happened, right? But look, for example, let's say that you entered the room, and you just entered the room, you went out, and someone asks you, like, did you see the red painting, right? So you have to retroactively like go back and pay attention to something like almost like from the future. You have to go to your past to pay attention to something. And I think that's something interesting in this way, that we always, or like, as most of our experience as humans is like linear and sequential, to think in terms of like the future affecting the past. I think that in a way, I think it's always like interesting, and regarding and talking about attention and everything, I think that could be like an interesting way of looking at it. Also, like, it's this is dangerous because like the thought is not fully cooked yet, so maybe I sound like crazy, but and also, like, for me, like, I've always thought that, for example, everything is happening at the same time, like the future, the past, and here, like, it's happening at the same time. So if you take that like into that thought, and you apply and that consequences to attention, what would that mean? Because like, I'm trying to think through it, because if everything is happening at the same time, like the past, present, and future, in a kind of like real sense, that, for example, like someone that lived 100 years ago, like, is like experience its life like in a present and stuff, but for us it's the past, and for someone in the future it's going to be the same for us. So I don't know, like, how does, just like, well, just like food for thought, like, how does attention, if you take that implication, then everything is happening at the same time, and attention is this kind of almost like will and or agency to engage with the person and stuff. So yeah, I think that's interesting. If you kind of place attention or the moment in that frame, I think it looks, I think it almost looks different, but I cannot fully explain it yet. But I think that's like an interesting thing, at least. But yeah, that's my thought. Yeah.
Well, Emilio, first off, yeah, we just got to cancel your classes. Second, to Javier's comment, proper attention looks like petting your cat and feeding it when it needs you, not being at school, Javier. So get on that. Third, I just finished Bergson's Memory and Matter, and everything you said made me think about that, because basically the entire experience of time is relative to attention and unfolding, and actually there's a lot in there about time being relation to Mr. Ebert's work. Now, I cannot claim at all, it would not even dare to claim that I understand Bergson, but what is very fascinating is that basically time is the space is the blueprint of time, and that it's all relative to attention, and memory and perception are two sides of the same coin. And oh my gosh, anyway, it's pretty wild. Don't know what to do with it, but it's really interesting. And there's something in Bergson. And then Mr. Ebert also brought up figuring out Deleuze and Hegel together, and that seems to be like the rub conversation. That's like a big deal. So anyway, Emilio, I like what you were saying. Let me give it to Dimitri and then Mr. Ebert.
So on this dialectic between unfreedom and freedom, and yeah, I think I would like to bring anxiety and anguish and fear into this conversation. Yeah. I think those are very crucial. And you know, when you can see that someone is dealing with a lot of anxiety and you're with this person in the room, you know, and then when a moment that you're relaxed, you can tell them like, hey, relax. There's nothing going on. There's no problem. You know, there's nothing going on. Of course, that would worsen it because they would like, oh, what do you mean relax? Like I'm relaxed. You know, oftentimes it's like this is the level at which it's working at, right? It's not even acknowledged that this emotion is there. Anyhow, that's one way it can function. And when there's this unconscious anxiety in that person, they're living. Maybe we could say that they are living in a moment, but the moment they are living in is very constricting or claustrophobic or makes them feel captured, you know, or yeah, of course, when we're in crowds, lots of people get anxious and stressed to be in crowds and stuff like this. Like they feel the lack to breathe and things. Now, what's interesting about this in regards to the question about freedom is that I think really it's one of the most beautiful things that Hegel ever said. He said, pure anguish is absolute affirmation. So when you when you fall into like that, you know, negative spiral or that void, and you're completely submerged by anxiety and you're just kind of overtaken by it, or you don't even know that you're in it. Like this is an absolute affirmation for Hegel. So that again goes back to, you know, like you need unfreedom to be free and to, you know, act upon your own yeah, free subjectivity in this sense. Now, of course, it's what Hegel is saying doesn't mean that you just, you know, like being anxious all the time is great or something because you're absolutely affirming existence on a godlike manner or something. But it does entail some kind of responsibility, also tying to the question of agency and freedom. That, you know, you're still responsible for your own anxiety because there is this case of you know, positioning yourself, or yeah, the responsibility of how you position yourself, or responsibility of like presupposing existence or Dasein.
Well, Dimitri, I'm in your debt because now I understand why the children are always destroying the living room, because the anguish is the affirmation. So they've read a lot of Hegel. I really appreciate that. And it is quite interesting. Like if we look at the philosophy of right, there's a real sense in which the very anxiety of facing determinants or determination then has a kind of call to make them in your mind necessities for your freedom. So that's kind of a way I word it, the movement from determination. Now, the language changes from scientological differently, but it's like determination to necessity. How do you come to the place where you make a determination a necessity? And that requires a lot of work, and a part of the state is to bring that about. But let me give it to Mr. Ebert and then Emilio. And before I forget, you reminded me, our kids won, like on Christmas Eve, watching this show, Is It a Cake? Where they like cut into things at the end and you find out if it's a cake or not. Emilio knows what I'm talking about. That's another one, Mr. Ebert, like the British baking show. That's an addicting show. It's dangerous stuff right there, Mr. Ebert.
Is it a cake?
Is it cake? Or something?
Is it cake?
Yeah.
They like
Okay,
have these expert
actually
bakers.
good.
What's that?
Okay, I'm gonna watch that.
Oh, dude, it's amazing because they have like all these things. You can't tell what is the cake and what is the actual item. Like it's made like antiques and stuff. Really, some major drama.
And
That's
there's
anxiety right there, actually.
Sensible music, and they like bring the knife. They're like,
it's crazy, man. That's all Hegel was writing about.
That's funny. Okay, I'm just gonna kind of, these are just sort of riffs. I was writing down some notes, but I find this, to me, this conversation is and it seems like every time I come here, or at least every time I open my mouth, these sort of, this is just sort of the where it's at. I think this is where philosophy is at, is this spot. And I wanted to clarify a few things and put forward a few ideas regarding the moment and what is that final gaze, the last gaze, and what is the state of being the witness state or the observer, and as all that relates to attention. So okay, so the mind, and I think I brought this up here before, but very generally speaking, And by the way, Chitan, like your vision of the mind is very in line with it's some theory of mind that is the going theory on consciousness versus unconsciousness, and it is called like the practical theory of mind or something. I can't remember at the moment, sorry. But basically what it says is that attention only occurs when things go wrong. Or I should say, to put it in their terms, the conscious frame only sort of pops into motion. So consciousness really only as a unitary frame that can only take care of one item, one object at a time, only really pops into motion as attention when something is going wrong, when we need to actually problem solve. Because the real premise of the brain and the mind is to actually absent everything into the unconscious, to make everything automatic. So we learn words not so that we can think like, oh, what's that word? And so we're constantly like, what's the word for the thing that's orange? And look, oh, orange. That's not the whole purpose of language acquisition, is that it becomes automatic, that we focus on it, then it goes into the unconscious. And I think that the thing, the Deleuzian thing of like, orange, making that process of repetition and excess sort of like really overt is an amazing way to understand how saturation of relation really does yield the indeterminate, where suddenly or same thing happens when you stare at someone's face for too long, right? Suddenly they become like this fucking Shiva, like it just doesn't make any sense. And they're everything at once, right? And so there's a saturation that can occur that completely distorts the determinate forms. And that's a great analogy that we can actually, heuristic that we really can use. Now, what I want to bring up is that indeterminacy of a saturation of relations, so like face, whoa, or orange, well, orange, like what does that mean? And you start having, it's in Larry David, Curb Your Enthusiasm a lot. He'll start saying words over and over again and be like airplane, and it'll be like, whoa, it's actually, there's a name for this phenomenon that I can't remember at the moment. But so we think about the fact that the mind is always trying to sort of absent things through this like excess into the indeterminate form of what is orange now. Well, that's a great example of like where orange lives in our unconscious is in that saturated indeterminate state, because we don't need to think about orange. Orange doesn't mean, it's just coming. It doesn't have a determinate identity in our conscious frame. We're no longer aware of it as such. And in that sense, the unconscious is the rhizomatic moment. The unconscious is that excess of repetition that is absented, which from that place of absented excess, replete absence, so stuffed and thick with meaning, that it literally can take on any form. Very similar to like looking at the Shiva, the face that turns into a Shiva, or whatever the case is. Now, Deleuze's critique of Hegel, or Deleuze's critique of Chomsky, or Deleuze's critique of like most things, is that they don't have this rhizomatic aspect to them, right? They're arborescent, not rhizomatic. They can't just like sprout out in a million different ways, but actually they can. And that's the bridge between the Hegel and the Deleuze to me, is that the Hegelian concept is this notion of repetition, and then it becomes orange. And then I've gotten in arguments where people are like, that's linear, like you can't do like nonlinear algebra with that concept. Well, yes, you can, because once you've saturated it, that's when it takes on its indeterminacy. That's when it suddenly becomes whatever the fuck. That's when it suddenly can have all sorts of weird meaning and become metonymic, whatever it is, and take on all these interesting meanings and escape the very confines within which you saturated that form to begin with. Lastly, when we talk, or when I'm talking about like, where is that, the place of the observer who is not being observed? Well, in my view, it's the unconscious. That's actually what it is. So it's not everything that I'm talking about in this sense is very much contained within the subject. And yes, it's intersubjective and we're all sharing language and sharing all of that, but That place of like God, that's in the unconscious. That place of like the witness, unconscious. All of these things are in that state of the unconscious. So it's difficult to like pull ourselves away, especially in a capitalist tradition or like a know-how sort of go-get-em tradition of like attention being not necessarily a good thing, or like you're not paying attention, you know. But it is like, if we drop that and we neutralize those terms, it does seem to be that the point of spirituality is actually to, or I should say meditation, is in a way to drop unitary focus and attention and move yourself into the unconscious, wherein everything is so replete that it can take on any sort of form, and you're in the moment. And the moment is the moment because of that congestion of relation, which yields a transcendence of relation. Anyway, blah, blah, blah.
Outstanding, Mr. Ebert. Enjoy that very much. Dimitri, and then Emilio, I will comment on that. So, you know, one of the, you know, Heidegger has this kind of idea where he makes the point, we say, hey, did you notice you only notice a doorknob when it's broke? Like, otherwise it's invisible. You just kind of use it and you go on. And basically he wants to say that all of Western philosophy with the question of being is making a mistake of asking about something you only notice when it's broke. Like the very act of philosophy breaks up life into things it is not and asks about those, of which is a mistake, because when like the way you actually live is the doorknob's invisible. But this is very strange, because how do you think about the invisible? Because the moment you think about it, it's not invisible, right? How does consciousness think about the subconscious without turning it into consciousness? So there's this weird move, and that's where, for me, like Derrida described Heidegger as always like a wave hitting the beach. He's like orbiting this thing that he can't ever get at because it's this really strange thing. And I think you're exactly right, where there is this movement where exactly attention occurs as a survival mechanism, right? But then Heidegger is almost talking about, is it possible to have a kind of attention that honors the invisible without breaking up the invisible, the clearing he talks about, where being comes through? Maybe that's possible, maybe it's not, but that's kind of a way to think about his project. It's also very interesting. I was talking with Guy Sinstock, and there's this question where like all these religions are talking about needing to get rid of the ego and like getting beyond the ego, and the ego is bad. And then there's this question, well, then why do we have the ego? Like, why is it there then if it's like totally bad? And there's like almost two options. There's almost a way in which, if indeed like pure experience as the Kyoto school is kind of what you're trying to get to, kind of a place of total saturation, something you're born into, have the mirror stage and you lose, is there something about, it's almost like you need the ego precisely to lose it. And a transformation occurs in you that couldn't happen if you didn't gain the ego to lose. If you just straight stayed in pure experience or total saturation, that would not be a proper development. You actually have to go into this ego to then lose it to have a different kind of pure experience. You could almost say, let's use this language. You have pure experience, ego, total saturation. Now the pure experience is basically, it's the before the mirror stage total sat, but it's almost like you need the ego to lose the ego. Or you can just say the ego is a giant mistake. Like we would, you know, there's really no difference between the pure experience and the total saturation. We just got screwed because the brain's not wired right or something. But there's like, it's kind of like those questions, right? Like, does the ego, do you actually gain something by coming out of pure experience to an ego you can then lose into total saturation? Or is it just a kind of, we took a wrong turn, but every single brain is wired to take a wrong turn. It's just how we're just kind of screwed. It does seem as if there's some unique benefit that comes from gaining the ego to lose. I guess you could basically say, well, if you didn't, you'd never be conscious. You'd just be that baby that couldn't tell its image in the mirror or whatever. So, but there does seem to be, and it is interesting, and then I'll give it to Emilio. Like all of my favorite philosophers have this weird like return move where the return is not the same. Like David Hume, you start in common life, you go to the philosophy, and then you need to return to common life, but it's not the same. Like in Hegel, the return is never a return. It's always the RE is in parentheses, right? And all these religions also have a kind of like, you go on this journey, and I don't want to, I know there's a hero's journey. I don't want to overlay like too much with that, although I think there's truth to it. I think Joseph Campbell actually, his books can be pretty interesting, but that's another subject. But there is this really interesting kind of notion that there is something about the return that seems similar to the repetition that we're saying, and yet, and that it brings something new in it, and you need to go through that. but it's very difficult to have a return as opposed to just going to the next experience, going on and never returning, or and maybe that's the spurious infinity at that point. Because like absolute knowing itself is a kind of realization of something that was always the case, right? And yet what's weird is realizing something that is always the case is better than just having things always be the case without realizing it. There's something that occurs there, the dare I say true infinity of Hegel, that seems so important. But let me give it to Emilio and Chita.
Yeah, also, and this I'll say this and I'll have to go, but like for me it's really interesting because always like I really like meta stuff, so I try to always like go a step back, and like for example when we are discussing the subject, we think of a very specific version of subject that's like individualistic, and that's like, well, to my understanding, that was a recent phenomena, and I thought about it a little bit more, and maybe it's not, but like we always think of like a human as like an atomic unit that relates with other things, right? We don't see the human as being other things. It's like an atomic thing. And I mentioned this before, but there's like this tribe in Melanesia that they have, that they don't see that they see themselves as like walking trees, right? So their whole perception of themselves is like widely different, right? It would be like they don't have like an ego in the regular sense that we talk about it, probably because they think of themselves as part of the nature, and in a very literal sense, and so much so that there's in one of these texts, like someone from this like specific tribe community goes into a big city, and he learns for the like he sees himself in the mirror for the first time, right? And it's weird because of course like you can see your reflection in water, but he sees his reflection for the first time, and he realizes like he's handsome, and he becomes like this individual like stuff, and it's weird because once that you go into that individualistic way of viewing things, like it's, well, at least in the story, like it doesn't seem that you can go back. It kind of like captures your way and modes of thinking about the world. And I think that's really interesting because like everything about attention and stuff, we filter it through something that's like really akin to our experience, individualistic ego. But but that's not necessarily the case. We can experience something. It's weird, right? Because as you said, like if the individual is different, even if we think of the individual as being distributed, like if we'll like for example, if we think of trees as part of ourselves in a very real sense because of our respiratory system, like, or if we think about other people as like of course, like an extension of ourselves in a very real way, like that, I think changes if the way that we relate to these questions of subject, because like suddenly the subject is not just this human with a mind, is this human with a mind that has also like feel that it's, I don't know, it's bigger than that because it connects with this other stuff, these other brains and these other types of nature and things. So when you view the subject as something like bigger than just like a human body and mind, then it becomes like weirder, right? Because it like some of the notions that we think like don't really fit anymore. And I just really like that idea because it breaks some conventions. But yeah, it's been lovely. I have to run. I'm already late, but it's been so wonderful to see you. Yeah.
Tell your teacher it's our fault. Just tell us these freaking people in Virginia we don't know. But Emilio, good to see you, sir. Good to see you. It's a pleasure, sir. And I'll pass it to Chita, Mr. Ebert, and I'll just comment on that quickly. First off, I'm wondering if like ChatGPT is going to have a mirror stage. Like, is AI one day going to look at the mirror and be like, oh my gosh, I'm on a computer. What the heck? What it will do to it. And it also means, so this is the thing, like indeed, there are different conceptions of the subject. But it's almost like where Heidegger, Hegel is like the question of the category as such, not just a new category, but the category of such, and the movement of thought itself, not just like the thought of a thing, but thought itself. And all the fun that brings with it. It's almost like wherever you start from, whatever your conception of the subject is, or of the community, or whatever, it's almost like the return itself. No one can start. It's like you can't start anywhere and it works. Like the human person doesn't get what it quote unquote needs, if you grant me that. If it stays in whatever it starts, but it also doesn't get what it quote unquote needs if it goes somewhere, right? There's something about the return as such that seems to be transformative. And what is that true? Why? What is that return? What's going on in that return? Why is that uniquely the return as such? I always love adding as such because it's like, okay, what does that mean again? Okay, the thing is, I think so. I'm not sure. Return as such. So what is transformative about the return as such that seems to matter in this? And then what does that look like? And then I'll pass to whoever wants to speak. Chetan.
Yeah, I'm remembering Nietzsche, whatever you will return in that sense. And, how do you, the eternal return in that, Yeah. I think Ebert's point about, there being this background of rules is actually extremely important there. That, we need these background rules which sort of function automatically for us to be able to do anything with them. For if you take language, I can only speak language when I have all of these rules coded in my head, which are functioning, completely unconsciously or in that sense. If you think about grammar, if you actually trying to create the rules of language, you can't speak it. You have to have it completely unconsciously, which is what Chomsky's point of universal grammar comes from in that sense. So to that degree, I think one can't get away from this total background that comes with. But the problem with, I think, attention is that attention always finds itself somewhat in excess to that. That if attention has to find, it has to solve any immediate needs. If it's to be solving any immediate goals, it's not attention. It's not. Look, it may be doing that, but that is not its characteristic property. Attention actually comes from this relative freedom of the organism from its own immediate needs. And how do we construct that form of, even if you have to think about how would something like that evolve? Of course, one Freudian answer would be that it evolved in the sense that we are able to select something from the environment, such that it may come to your some kind of a solution or some kind of a answer later on. It may solve some internal need later on, but that cannot be predicted in advance. That is something that has to be happening completely in the background. You can't attend to something thinking that it will solve a need later on. Then attention itself is getting destroyed, which is what is happening. And if you start thinking about what are the principles of the selection from the outside, upon which this attention sort of gets, you'll realize that there are no fixed principles possible for attention. Attention always functions because it can create its own rules from the context itself. If you have any predetermined rules, again, you're not really attending to anything. And as we said, if it can be predicted, it can be, given these contours in that sense. And I'll just add an extra distinction that I sort of skipped over last time, and which I think Ebert's comment actually makes me go there. Because when you start thinking about, say, secondary retentions, which I said, the memory and so on and so forth, Ebert is right that to some degree, whatever primary retention we have, whatever information we get from our attention in that sense, eventually goes into the background. It becomes automatic later on, but that is how it can come from later need in that manner. It always goes into the background. But there's another possibility of it. The other possibility is what you would call tertiary retention. Say, I may see something and I write it down. I forget it. So now I know my phone numbers in my mobile phone. I know I can go back and look up the phone number through this technology in that sense, and I don't need to remember it anymore. And with time, what happens? I can completely stop paying attention to phone numbers because I know I have a way of retrieving them automatically from and I think that's a good site to understand that how our attentions can be completely outsourced to these external forms of and at what point these starts going backwards. My only sort of slightly finding a slight point of disagreement, because it should be to that when you start thinking of attention as itself coming from or being placed within the unconscious, I don't remember the way Ebert sort of phrased it, but if you start thinking of the relationship between attention and the unconscious, my only sort of discomfort in that sense, I think phrasing it the way Ebert phrased it, that would be that actually unconscious sort of emerges exactly at the point of the gap which sort of come from these background rules and these informations, memories, and so on and so forth. Unconscious as such cannot be accessed. There's a problem there. That how do you place yourself at the unconscious as such? Even in Hegelian things, Hegel sort of talks about it as a point of gap within a certain system. That's what his absolute knowledge sort of comes to you, that finding a relationship with the gap back again. But how do you start from that gap? Eventually, you have to start from the content. The gap comes from an engagement with the gap of that content itself, with that system itself. So how would you in some senses put the horse before the cart in that sense? Gap comes from thinking through the concrete information that you get in that sense. And how would you, think through that? I think that would be Ebert's. Yeah. Thanks.
Wonderful. Let me give it to Mr. Ebert, then Dimitri. And we lost Javier. He went to pet his cat, so he did indeed listen to give the right attention. But let me give it to Mr. Ebert and then Dimitri.
Oh yeah, just to say that I totally, at least where my thinking is at right now, I totally agree with what Chitan is saying, actually. So there may have been some incomplete communication on my end. The way I'm formulating it at the moment is that the unconscious is formed by the subjective limitations which get accessed vis-a-vis essentially experience. And these stimulations or stimuli that are in excess of our cognitive capacities, in excess of our comprehension, the sort of story I tell, it's not a perfect story, but when you wake up and it's a dark, you're in a dark room and the light of day, you open the curtains and the light of day first hits you, it's an overwhelming amount of light and you're momentarily blind due to the overwhelming amount of stimuli. But then the brain or the mind absents that excess and normalizes it into an equilibrium. And where did that excess light go? And I'm being a little liberal here with the analogy, but the excess light didn't disappear. It was adjusted and essentially moved. You could almost think of the excess light being moved into the background so that you can sort of stabilize your vision and pick out determinate forms from within that scape of light. So the unconscious is created by interaction with the world and through our subjective limitations and our limitations in being able to comprehend the external world, essentially meeting up with those limitations either through repetition or just simple excess, create sort of this state of the unconscious. However, where I would backtrack and sort of challenge, or at least this is my intuition, that, and I think this would be Hegel's intuition, the unconscious, as the excess absence of subjective limitation, is isomorphic with, or essentially in terms of its interiority, in terms of the density of relation within its interior, it is isomorphic with God or with the totality. So whatever that ultimate view is, if we were to even decide that it was there, like the very reason we get to experience God is because we cannot experience God. And we rub up against our own limitations. We create that saturation vis-a-vis drive to experience the transcendent. We can't get there. And because we can't get there and we saturate that limitation, we get there. So that's sort of the ironic correlation or correspondence between the unconscious and the, let's say, ultimate final view or whatever. So in that sense, I would say that the unconscious does exist as such, not as the subjective limitation unconscious, but as a sort of transcendent unconscious, a universal unconscious.
Lovely, Mr. Ebert, and I'll give it to Dimitri. It makes me think how basically the adjustment that makes living possible necessarily means there is an quote unquote unknown. And Kant's mistake is to be like the thing of itself is unknowable, but really it is unknown, and that very unknown is what creates the possibility of adjustment so that you can actually function, right? Like the very fact that there is this blinding light when you come out the theater that you then adjust to makes it possible for there to be outside a theater, right? That you can operate in. And so the thing in itself, the quote unquote thing in itself that for Kant means it's inaccessible is precisely the condition for there to be things. It is not a limitation, it's the condition of possibility. And then the mistake is to say those things are unknowable as opposed to unknown, which means there's always something more, but what you do know is actually related to what the thing is. And that's where what you're bringing up with Hegel, I think that's the major question of the relation between notion and nature. And for Hegel, it's isomorphic. Like the way that notion unfolds is like nature unfolds, and therefore it's a two-way. So that's very, very well put. Let me give it to Dimitri here.
Yeah, I'm really glad God is being mentioned again in this. Since Daniel, you just mentioned the return, and the Christian mysticism, which Hegel turns into a science in his own form, comes from Neoplatonism and Plotinus Enniads. This is at least Hegel called Neoplatonism the zenith of ancient philosophy. He's massively inspired by it, anyhow. And in the Enniads, Plotinus writes about this path of like detachment of compounded things and a return, or like a turning to pure simplicity. Now, both the word pure and the word simple are things Hegel really likes to use. He uses the word pure all the time. He uses the word simple all the time. You know, when you first start reading Hegel, it's like, well, like none of this is simple. What are you talking about? But what he means by it, well, simple is how it's translated to English, and in Dutch and in German, it's in Dutch, it's eenvoud. I forgot the German word, but it kind of implies a one-sidedness. I think a literal way to translate it, either from the German or the Dutch, is to like, there's a one-foldedness to things. And it sounds very strange, and but the point is that, you know, like there's this necessity of one-sidedness. You know, Daniel, oftentimes you'll talk about the bothness of things, but there's also this, and you talk about, you know, like the problems of like the necessity of one-sidedness, but there's also something great and beautiful about it, especially since, you know, you can fall into like the pseudo over complexifications of things. So therefore, like Neoplatonism and Hegel are massively interested in returning to God as this pure simplicity. And this is, I think, where, again, Eckhart and Hegel agree that this, once you get to this level where you collapse the ground of yourself and the ground of God into the same ground, then there's just one knowing or one love, like Eckhart has described it.
It makes me think, like, to use that language of adjustment, which I like what Mr. Ebert was saying. If I go back to the philosophy of right, there's a way in which to kind of clarify that statement. So we find ourselves thrown in a world where when we walk out of the movie theater, our eyes have to adjust. And we have two options. Either we go, F this, my eyes shouldn't have to adjust. This is unfair and I'm angry. And I'm going to like rage against things because this has to occur. The role of the state is to come along and make you realize, hey, actually, no, you need to adjust so that you can see. And this is a necessary part of life so that you can function, as opposed to just kind of raging against the limitation that you go through is necessary. So you come to terms with it. One of the reasons Hegel is very critical of Kant is because by making the thing in of itself, the state doesn't have anything to do with actually you coming to terms with determinations that can become necessity because they're totally separate. So then the very legitimacy of the state, like what's the role of the state? well, then it's just pure oppression at that point, as opposed to helping you manage and live with the fact and come to terms with the fact that you have to adjust to function in the world. So you can kind of see a lot of what Hegel's political project is. And to come to terms with that adjustment, or, you know, another term I like to use is tragedy, right? One of the reasons why arguably politics today is so problematic is precisely because it's trying to get to the thing itself. Like it's trying to deny the possibility of the thing of itself. It's caught between, like Quentin will say that Kant left us with either hard scientism or fideism, where it's all faith or it's all science. And as a result, you have a very dysfunctional political project because it's not trying to manage the populace to come to terms with living with the adjustment, or living with the fact that you have to have your eyes adjust when you come out of the theater. We don't even think in those terms. In fact, we think the point of politics is to get your side to win, to get back to the truth of America, to get back to kind of the ideal, right? As opposed to sort of a more tragic vision. And the other thing too, what that makes me think of is, it's kind of like, it's almost like what you're saying about the simple and the complex. Oh, I was going to say with God, like in Dante and a lot of, when they talk about the hiddenness of God, if God wasn't hidden, we'd all be dead. Like if we didn't have to like adjust our eyes because God would overwhelm the system. So the very fact that God is not known and you have to like Dante describes it exactly what Mr. Ebert, where your eyes gradually adjust as you're climbing up the Paradiso. If Beatrice, as I say all the time, if Beatrice smiles too early, then Dante gets destroyed, reduced to ash, because he can't handle it, right? There has to be a gradual adjustment toward God, and then ultimately at the end, his wings fail the lofty fantasy, and so on and so forth, right? So there has to be this kind of movement, and precisely therefore, the hiddenness of God is why there is a God. Because if God was not hidden, we'd all be dead. You know, there wouldn't be anything but God. And then if God was all that was God, he wouldn't even be God. It would just be being or something, right? And so the very hiddenness, the very apathetic character of it that one has to adjust to is precisely why there is a thing to adjust to. In the same way that for Hegel, the limit of the thing of itself is precisely why there's a possibility space of being as subjects and becoming and so on and so forth. If you didn't have that limit, which the limit is precisely the enabling factor, right? Likewise, the very hiddenness of God is precisely the enabling factor, right? And so then instead of like, that would be a movement from, in Dante, you see a movement from determinant to necessity, where you're like, Matt, well, God, why are you always hidden? You're so cruel. You want nothing to, oh, necessity is when you say, oh, actually, I understand that the apathetic is necessary, that it's an enabling character. Likewise with the state, you go, why am I restricted by law? Why do I have to be in community? And you rage again, and then you learn from the state, oh, this is necessary so I can have freedom. So this flip from determinant that you rage against to necessity seems like a really, really big deal. And likewise, that seems to have some ramifications for this thinking about the conscious and the subconscious, the conscious and the unconscious, where you see this kind of dance between them becomes kind of almost, you can one way view it as kind of cruel and determinate. It's unfair because I'm always restricted. Oh, wait, it's necessary because it's actually good when parts of nature are subconscious and I'm not thinking about them. But there's also times where it's good to focus on somebody, because if I just treat them like a doorknob, I can objectify people, right? So you need to move into conscious attention, but then precisely to know them to the point where you can do it like a dance, where you don't think about it, right? It's almost like you pay attention to the person. And maybe this is kind of where we're talking about the baseball versus the person. A baseball, you can just go straight to the kind of place of total saturation, where at the person, you have to pay enough attention to them to figure out their dance moves or to figure out how they dance. So then you can, in the unconscious place, dance with them without thinking about it, because great, you know, art, jazz, dance go into a kind of unconscious place. And yet that unconsciousness is precisely a result of an unbelievable amount of work, right? And yet you're working to the place where you can play the piano without thinking about it. You're working to the place where you can dance with them without thinking about it and to relate to people in that sort of fashion. So the function of attention then is to get to that place where you can let it go. And likewise, the return is to let it go. And it makes me think, like I was saying, there seems to be a difference between the return to the womb, which is problematic in Freud, and the return to common life in David Hume, or the return that has this sort of transformative element. And it would seem like also in that return, you see the perfect blend of the simple and the complex, because if you're overly complex, it's a problem, but if you're overly simple, it's a problem as well. But when you return to common life, you suddenly go, wait, it's not the same. Wow, what I thought was simple has a complexity to it because the thing that is the same can change. oh, that's wild. But it's not so much complexity that then it's like disconnected or leads to abstraction. But it's also not that simplistically that, well, actually, it's not a simplicity that almost objectifies it. Because if you treat things too simply, you actually ignore the fullness of them, right? But then if you treat them too complexly, you abstract them from what they actually are in their concretion. So the return seems to have an ability to help bring together the simple and the complex, right? Like what you say, Hegel's God is simple, or God is simple. What the heck does that mean? It means there's no composite parts. Well, that sounds like total saturation, as Mr. Ebert's saying, right? Like the simple is the point where there are no composite parts, and yet there are composite parts. Not everything is the same, and yet now they're in the dance. In the dance, a dance is simple because there is a multiplicity that is brought together. There's a harmony, as we've talked about before. There is difference in that, yet there's unity, and these things come together. And it seems all of these different things, all these different ways is where you come to see the multiplicity that you are thrown in, that you're determined as a determinate. Once you come into being, you fall. The point is to reach a place where you see that multiplicity as a necessity for harmony. And one wants to go through life to the place where they can turn the determinant of multiplicity into the necessity of the condition of which makes possible harmony. With that, anyone have any final things to say on this lovely evening? I'm so glad we could have this chance. I'm glad it's like icing and everything out there. So I was glad that all of that did not be the case.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just want to say thank you for the dialogue. And I really enjoyed being a non-vocal participant, active participant through the whole thing, and observing what's going on in my psyche and coming through from my unconscious and into my conscious, and really just practicing staying communed with you all through the process, and also really appreciating the inclusion of God and some of these thoughts about the relationship between God and the unconscious are very novel, interesting ones for me. So I have no idea what I've downloaded today, but we'll see how it ripples down into my dreams and thoughts in weeks to come. And yeah, thanks so much, guys.
Well, thank you, Jacob. That means it put it in the unconscious, which is a good thing, Jacob. That's what you want, right? So thank you. But Mr. Ebert, please.
Oh, just quickly, I also really, as I said, I think this conversation is like this is where the meat is to me, meat and potatoes. But just want to say, for anyone who happens to have watched through this whole thing, which I would want to meet you, I could almost, I could almost.
1, 2. We've got all 5.
I could almost interpret everything. I loved everything you were saying, but I would want to just add that, and this is my own sort of idiosyncratic repulsion to intentionalism. And it's not that I hate intention, I just prefer incidentalism. And so there is a way to view everything Daniel just said from the incidentalist sort of standpoint, which is that apophatic absence of God is not necessarily an intentional absence, that God sort of, self-obscures,
right,
but is an absence created by the very fact of the immanence of information entering a limited capacity to cognize that immanence. And that excess within the subjective interior is itself going to absent, because it is too congested within the limitations of subjectivity. Awe is thus produced because it's a breaking of meaning, because relation has collapsed. Awe is produced, aka, the seeds of God. And so there's a way to view the whole thing as this sort of self-contained process, whereby vis-a-vis the limitations of the subject, God is simply created as that which is immanent and omni, or totally relational, meaning an absence of sort of relation, aka immanence. So just wanted to add that, and this was really fun, and
this was
really
fun.
Looking forward to this one for the last week. I missed you guys.
Well, we missed you as well, Mr. Eben. I just want to say I 100% agree. I think intention is very problematic. It's not intentionalism at all. It's the state of the situation. Like in Dante, it's not like God went, "Hey, I'm gonna be hidden for the fun of it." It's the condition. It's the situation, like you're saying. And it's very important to see it that way. Otherwise, there's kind of too much ego involvement, right? And so no, I agree. I agree with what you're saying. But it was very good to see you, Mr. Ebert. Thank you for coming. And I agree. I think this conversation, what you're getting at, like you said, the meat and potatoes, I agree. I agree with it. So I appreciate it.
Yes.
You guys are awesome. Thank you for being here.
It's wonderful.
I appreciate it. I'm still